Joseph Smith is increasingly coming under fire for his claim of translating the Book of Abraham along with its facsimiles. Egyptologists and other erudite naysayers have repeatedly stated that Joseph Smith's explanations and translations of the facsimiles are wholly erroneous. Nothing Joseph translated matches the translations of the experts. Yet, who is to say that the experts, with all their scholarly degrees, understand the texts themselves? Egyptologists themselves admit they do not understand the rudiments of Egyptian religion, the basis of the texts in question. To this day, scholars argue over the number and definition of the Egyptian pantheon of gods, over whether the religion was monotheistic or polytheistic, and over who these gods really were. For example, scholars still debate over the origin and identity of the god Osiris, whom all acknowledge as one of the primary gods of the Egyptian pantheon, and a key figure in the Book of the Dead, as well as in the Book of Abraham facsimiles. The fact is that Egyptologists simply do not know who or what Osiris was. The figure or myth of Osiris is found in all three facsimiles of the Book of Abraham. Facsimile number 1, for example, which Joseph describes as the attempted sacrifice of Abraham by a priest of Elkanah and Pharaoh, is iconographically based upon the mummification of Osiris by the god Anubis. Experts have argued that this is merely a common illustration from Egyptian texts, and has nothing to do with Abraham. Joseph, so the claim goes, has misinterpreted the scene and its characters. Yet, facsimile number 1, while sharing the overall design of the funerary scene, is quite different. The figure on the lion couch is clearly not Osiris, and the figure of the priest is certainly not the jackal-headed Anubis. The objections of the experts miss the point. Abraham, in the first chapter of his book, tells the reader exactly what the facsimile is. Abraham's claim, not Joseph's claim, is that facsimile number 1 is a representation that Abraham himself sketched. While Abraham may have drawn from Egyptian iconography to depict the sacrificial scene, it cannot be considered a direct replica of typical Egyptian funerary illustrations. Identifications of individual characters in facsimile number 1 cannot be made according to the norms of Egyptian funerary texts, since Abraham, not Joseph, has adapted them to fit another narrative. This pattern holds for the other facsimiles as well. Facsimile number 2, correctly identified as a hypocephalus, is especially direct in its insistence that whatever the Egyptian norms are for hypocephali and their interpretation, they do not apply to this facsimile. Joseph's explanation of the facsimile repeatedly uses the word represents. As in facsimile number 1, we have a representation and not a faithful or literal copy of an ordinary Egyptian hypocephalus. Furthermore, Joseph uses the word signify to explain what certain figures mean. This can only mean that the text is a form of symbolic encryption. Figure number 3 is especially important in understanding what Joseph, or more accurately, what Abraham is doing with this facsimile. Figure 3 is the figure of Ra on his so-called solar boat. Joseph's explanation, on the other hand, says that it is a representation of God on his throne. But the key here is that Joseph says that the figure has been intentionally changed. It has been made to represent God. Again, Abraham has adapted a pre-existing formula to meet his needs. In this case, Ra is being symbolically used to typify God. Not that the figure is not Ra, it is just that the figure must now be identified as God according to Abraham's symbolic adaptation. Each of the figures of the facsimile are symbolic representations and must be treated as such. Adhering to conventional interpretations mischaracterizes the claims of the facsimile itself. Facsimile number 3 follows the same pattern as the first two. Abraham has adapted a common scene from the Book of the Dead to tell an entirely different story. Joseph's explanation is symbolic. For example, the crown upon the seated figure's head represents the priesthood and is emblematic of the grand presidency in heaven. Figure 3 signifies Abraham in Egypt, again indicating a symbolic interpretation. It is not uncommon for artists to use known figures to represent others, according to the artist's intent and what he or she wanted to communicate. For example, Raphael used likenesses of contemporary artists to represent the great Greek philosophers in his famous fresco, The School of Athens. The two central figures of the fresco are universally understood to be Plato on the left and Aristotle on the right. The figure of Plato can be easily recognized as a likeness of Leonardo da Vinci. That is, Raphael painted Leonardo and then symbolically identified him or represented him as the Greek philosopher Plato. For the figure of Aristotle, Raphael painted Giuliano da Sangallo, an Italian sculptor, architect, and military engineer of the time. Now, no art expert would accuse Raphael of fraud for claiming that the figure on the left represents Plato when they all know that it is, in reality, a portrait of Leonardo da Vinci. It is an artistic convention that is well established. Note this self-portrait by Albrecht Dürer, who iconographically represents himself as Jesus Christ. Why then do Egyptologists accuse Joseph Smith of fraud when he, or rather Abraham, uses stock Egyptian characters to represent others in an alternative storyline? Joseph never claimed that the figures in the facsimiles were not Osiris, Hathor, Anubis, Horus, and so forth. He merely claimed that they represented Abraham and events in his life in Egypt. Joseph repeatedly states that the figures are representations and adaptations. Quibbling over identities misses the point entirely. The problem with the controversy over the Book of Abraham is not that Joseph Smith failed to understand basic Egyptian hieroglyphs. It is that Egyptian experts failed to understand Joseph's simple, straightforward English. A more profound and important reason for believing that the Book of Abraham is authentic is the embedded mythic archetypes of Chapter 3 discussed earlier in this episode. The claim, of course, by the experts is that Joseph Smith made up the entire Book of Abraham. This would mean that Chapter 3, in addition to the facsimiles, is pure fabrication. A review of the mythic symbolism in Chapter 3 demonstrates why Joseph Smith could not have made it up from whole cloth. The first part of Chapter 3 is dedicated to a description of a grouping of planets. The Lord, who is describing the system, calls these planets Kokabim, or stars. They are located near to what the Lord calls the throne of God, and are in the firmament of heaven. They all belong in an order to which our present earth belongs. The important point for our purposes here is that each star in turn is both above the next and greater, meaning larger than the first. It is an ascending group of planets, both in size and distance from Earth. Above also implies a linear relationship to all the planets. Our current solar system does not meet this description. The planets are never grouped in a line due to their different periods of orbit around the Sun. Furthermore, with Earth as a starting point, which is the point of reference for Abraham 3, whether one proceeds in the direction of the Sun or away from the Sun, the planets do not ascend in size and order as the Lord describes. In other words, the Lord is describing a planetary system, including our own Earth, which is wholly different than our current system. If Joseph were a fraud, then he would have had to make this system up. However, as we shall see, this ancient system existed exactly as described in Abraham 3. Chapter 3 next turns to the use of catasterism, the ancient archetype of equating souls and stars. The order of planets is used to describe an ascending order of intelligences, with the Lord being the most intelligent of all, just as Kolob was the greatest of the Kokabim. Granted that many of the great writers and philosophers of the world have used catasterism in their works. Yet, where would Joseph Smith learn of it, since he would have had to use this ancient archetype by design, along with the imaginary planetary system it drew upon? It is not as if Joseph had access to the great libraries, or even the time to study the classics. Inherent in the description of the planetary system is the inescapable fact that one of the planets of this order must be a comet. A planet with a cometary tail divided into 7 parts provides the basis for the Lord's exposition on the ruling spirits, the archangels. Our present order of planets, which we call the solar system, does not have a comet with a visible tail, or has any formation of planets or planetary attributes which could possibly provide such a symbolic image. Another planet must be nested within the planet comet in axial alignment. This is required for the mythic archetype of standing in the midst to work, where this planet appears to be within the middle of the plasma tail of the cometary planet, at least from the perspective of the earthbound viewer. This planet must be considered male to represent the hero figure of myth. In the book of Abraham's case, it represents the Lord. Extending the requirements of Joseph's rod, Joseph must make up an entire planetary system unknown to the world of experts. This system must include the Earth. It must fit the symbolic requirements embedded in Chapter 3. It must also provide the physical basis for the mythological archetypes found throughout the ancient world. Lastly, this planetary system must be independently verified by scholars wholly unconnected with the LDS Church or, more generally, with Mormonism. Dave Talbot and Wal Thornhill have reconstructed the ancient congregation of planets, which they call the polar configuration, exactly as Chapter 3 of the Book of Abraham describes. Joseph describes this very system in facsimile number 2. In fact, facsimile number 2 is a representation of the ancient order of planets. The concentric circles of the facsimile correspond to the nested planets, with the horizontal and vertical bars and squares forming the cruciform pattern of the polar configuration. The level of detail and extraordinary correspondence of these details with the mytho-historical record, as reconstructed by independent experts, precludes any possibility of fraud. One cannot simply make up a new planetary system unknown to mainstream science, and construct it so that it fits the historical record and works within a complex symbolic framework. Of course, mainstream Egyptology knows nothing of these things, and therefore is not competent to adjudicate whether or not Joseph was a fraud. Instead of being a fabrication, Chapter 3 of the Book of Abraham is an authentic record penned by the patriarch himself. Joseph Smith was a faithful translator in all respects.